Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adel Al-Omri, and first I would like to welcome you all to this webinar session entitled COVID-19 Impacts on Global Supply Chain Facts and Perspectives. This webinar is part of a series of webinars held in partnership with the Ministry of Transport and Communication and the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University, whose faculty are delivering the webinars. Today's webinar will be delivered actually by two speakers, with Professor Lausin Karbash, who is a professor in supply chain and operation management at the Division of Engineering Management and Decision Science at the College of Science and Engineering, and myself, Dr. Adel Al-Omri. I'm an assistant professor in supply chain and operation management in the same division. As you know, actually the COVID-19 pandemic continued to grow across all continents, causing large-scale loss of lives, human suffering, threatening the world health care systems. However, COVID-19 is not only a health crisis, it's actually turning to a major economic crisis. In today's webinar, we will focus on this aspect of the pandemic by discussing the implications of COVID-19 on logistics and supply chain in order to understand what went wrong and what strategy should be considered to help company recover from this major disruption and the future ones. To this end, we will be discussing basically two push-pull questions, with me starting with investigating or intending to answer a question, what went wrong, what is to blame for supply chains collapsing during the COVID-19 outbreak, and with Professor Lausin, who's going to look at how to rethink supply chain structure. Basically, he will be taking the automobile industry as example. So without any further ado, I will start my part of the webinar, which is actually part of ongoing research work, joint research work with Dr. Zaitaou, Dr. Lausin, and Dr. Abdel Fattah Al-Omri. Actually, before getting into the answering the questions, there are a few actually contextual background to discuss in order to understand the holistic picture. And there is a need actually to understand what is supply chains and what are the risks in supply chain before getting into the COVID-19 pandemic issue. So I will start first by a very quick background on what is a supply chain, how supply chains have been evolving in the past decade. Well, a very simple question: what is supply chain? To understand what is a supply chain, I would say just pick up any item you have at home. And think about its journey before that item ended up in your hands or in the shelves of the supermarket. You will find out that if you push that thinking towards the upstream end of the journey, technically any product will end up in Mother Nature as a raw material, wood, fruit, gold, iron, and any other type of raw material. Now, what is a supply chain? The supply chain basically is that network of facility and parties that are involved to perform the function of the procurement of that raw material, the transformation of those material into intermediate and finished products, and then the distribution of those products to the customer. Supply chain actually went through exists since forever. since humanity existed, of course, in a simplified manner. However, main milestones started after the Industrial Revolution, and more importantly, in the early previous century, with, I would say, three main characteristics phases. With the first one called mass manufacturing, mass production, also referred as Fordism, in reference to Henry Ford, where basically the focus is producing massive products because there is a need, there is a market, the demand, the imbalance, the supply the demand is huge, and there is very few number of companies that would supply that market. The second area is, the second phase is the lean manufacturing. So after starting producing a huge quantity, and then a lot of suppliers started to boom into the market, then there was a need to rethink the optimization of costs, the inventory management, and later on to rethink what is called the lean manufacturing and the just-in-time techniques and so forth. And that was born somehow in Japanese companies such as Toyota. Now, basically, I would say in the past 2 decades, we get into a modern, what we call supply chains, with typically here we get into the supply chain management as we know today, with all complexity, including alliances, collaboration, and so on. And in this phase, actually, the focus is centered around the customer and mass customization. Lastly, with the democratization of the internet technology and IoT, ICT, and with also globalization and upper market, we stepped into new actually era, what I call the global and intelligent supply chain. To understand basically what is nowadays supply chains, what nowadays supply chains looks like, just look at this picture taken from the US Chamber of Commerce, and just putting together all the parties involved in manufacturing a Boeing 787. As you see, there is a huge number of countries collaborating to just get one product in place. So here one might think that this might be completely normal for such complicated and huge product. You'll be surprised that the picture would be similar or same for much simpler product, such as a pair of jeans or a pen or something similar, where each of those products actually is involving many countries and is produced across several continents. So to summarize, modern supply chains are global, span across many countries. They are financially complex, involving different financial stakeholders. They are digital, involving a lot of ICT technology, and they are focused around the lean and the just-in-time manufacturing. As a result, supply chains are very cost-effective and they are very responsive. With this being said, questions that comes here is, how about the risk and disruption in such a huge and complex network? We are going to address this in the next few slides to understand what is the notion of risk and what is it in global supply chains. This picture actually is very interesting picture, summarizing basically and giving a holistic view about the different risks in supply chain and their category, basically, depending on whether they are technological, basically ICT, cyber here, it could be, or it could be any infrastructure failure, such as in machinery, equipment, and so on. It can be economic, like price volatilities, demand shocks, waves, shortage fluctuations, currency fluctuation. It can be geopolitics, such as terrorism attacks, such as trade war, such as policy, regulation. And finally, it can be environmental, such as natural disaster, pandemic, and so forth. As you see in the picture here, each of these risks has certain probability and has a certain, let's say, degree on how it can be dealt with or not. The most difficult ones are those with lower probability and higher impact. I'll not go further. I'll just share with you some sample examples here through the news. You might find example like the Japan earthquake and tsunami in 2011, the hurricane. This can be in the category of natural disaster. There can be also the strike, the West Coast port strike in 2015. There can be also here another type, which is the famous 2008 financial crisis, the 9/11 terrorist attack, the world trade currently between China and US, and actually is threatening a lot of supply chains. So we might have, all of us, ideas about and heard about these previous, let's say, major disruption in the past decade. One important point to know is that these disruption comes at a very, very high cost. And here are very simple numbers just to tell you how big and how important the loss can be. I would just want to bring attention here to something very important is it's not only the financial impact, but also the recovery time impact. So how long it would take for a supply chain or a company to recover from a disruption. And as you can see in this few examples, let's say the Japan earthquake, the US-China trade war, we are actually in a few months. While all these risks and disruption are somehow local, they are with a limited magnitude. Question now, how about the coronavirus pandemic effect, which is actually broader and a much with a higher magnitude than all of these pandemic, all of these previous risks. In the future slide, we just want to share here some of what can be the implication of the coronavirus on the supply chain and how this can be assessed. Of course, here the coronavirus has actually impacted all the links of the supply chain from demand, operation, and supply. To understand, very simple picture actually, to understand why actually the COVID-19 is impacting the whole and the global economy and trade. Here I just put two pictures together. The black one actually, which is I think everyone is looking at in the past weeks and past months, which is the evolution or the map of the coronavirus. So this picture actually is the most recent one, but everyone knows that the pandemic started in Asia, mainly in China, and then evolved to include basically all countries in all the world. The second picture actually is from the global trade flow that shows the global trade flow between countries in 2018. And if you put the two pictures together, you understand that the major spots such as China, India, Europe, and US are threatened by the pandemic. And this is actually why the global economy and trade has been impacted. Some estimation actually about how critical is this crisis. So the world trade is expecting the world trade to fall by 13 to 32% as a pessimistic scenario. I would say here that pessimistic scenario was actually somehow estimated in March, April, where we still have kind of optimistic view that the crisis will be ending somewhere in the summer. Now, thoughts are more toward that this crisis will persist for longer, and then that means that the 32% as a lower bound is much more than that. Similarly, that the global economy will drop by -3%. This is a very optimistic estimation, in my opinion. So this is about global global trade. So how about the supply chain? Supply chains actually are the glue or blood vessel of the global trade and economy. They are somehow affected in all the links, starting from the supplier, supply, distribution, production, and demand. And this simply because of the measure like the lockdown, the border closure between countries, in addition to many of the workers have been actually staying at home. Some of them, they were even sick and somehow. So sourcing has been disrupted. There is no enough parts. There are no enough workers to turn the machines. So production stopped. Distribution in Europe, in every country, is actually needs drivers, needs people to move the goods either by airplanes or by trucks and so on. Similarly, there is no one that could move the goods, even though in some cases the goods are there, but the distribution has been disrupted. The demand, of course, here the demand is, which is the main driver of the supply chain, has been severely affected. So people, they are staying home, so they don't purchase anymore. There is demand volatility for some specific products, not only the medical supply, such as masks and all this sanitizer and so on, but also goods with long duration, such as pasta, rice, and so forth. And then with less demand to some other sectors, which makes actually the whole supply chain a very collapse in many sectors. As example, I will take, this actually applies in pharmaceutical supply chains, in food supply chains, manufacturing supply chains, and so on. Very simple example is the food supply chain, and this is taken from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, where we seriously think that the COVID-19 may turn the health crisis into famine and into food crisis. And this is simply because all the food supply chains has been actually threatened by the pandemic, with a shortage of labor to produce and process food, with transport restriction blocking food delivery, and with a demand decreased for perishable goods, commodity, and increase of demand for some other types of goods. And seriously, we're thinking that in addition to some other factors, that the pandemic is could be turning actually the world into a very major food crisis. Now, this being said, actually, you might find a lot of numbers, description about all of this in the net. But a good question to ask here: why is this collapse? What is to blame for the supply chains to fail during the pandemic? If you just ask around, or you'll go into the internet and so on, you will find that a claim that supply chains failed during the pandemic because they are because of their over reliance on just-in-time or lean manufacturing, on being centralized in terms of production. So all the production are somehow in China, South Asia, and so on, and being very long and complex supply chain. Some others, they would say that the supply chain nowadays, supply chains, they are too much into cost efficiency rather than being taking into consideration risks and risks, because many companies actually they are applying some of these concepts in a different way, so that they are too much into the cost efficiency, just by chasing that very cheap supplier in somewhere without really taking into account the risks behind. However, the just-in-time and the lean manufacturing and all of these, they are not really what is to blame. What is to blame really is the lack of resilience. This is really what is to blame for supply chain failing during the COVID-19. So to discuss this, we need first of all to understand what is resilience and how it can be achieved. So simply, resilience is the ability of a material to recover to its original shape following a deformation. This is in material science. Now, in supply chain, the concept is really the same as resilience refers to the capability of a supply chain to respond and recover quickly to an expected disruption, or even to be in a new, better situation. So here there are two important things in the supply chain resilience definition. So we have what is the risk. We have very important how quick the supply chain would recover. It means the recovery time. And then a most important thing is what is the status of the company after being recovered. Is the company is getting back to the original state or to a better state? Definitely here, now there are thoughts that the resilience can be perceived as a competitive advantage as we might move definitely to a better stage. There is actually a misbelief about how to achieve resilience. So if you just ask around or Google, you might find that a lot of people that are saying that resilience can be achieved by maintaining a high level of inventory across the supply chains and by creating a lot of redundancy in the machines, having low capacity, having multiple suppliers, and so on. And many would say that for this reason, resilience and profit cannot coexist. Okay. Up to a certain extent, resilience, up to a certain extent, redundancy for sure can help dealing with a disruption in the short term. That's sure, because if you have high inventory and then for some reason your supplier doesn't send the goods on time, then you have enough inventory to work or to deliver to your customer. But usually this is actually in the short term. In the long term is not a robust solution, and it comes with a high cost. For the second part, definitely resilience and profit can coexist. I will elaborate more on this later, but a very good answer to this is the Toyota, which is actually one of the most resilient company in the world. On the same time, is one actually of the company that is using the lean, the just-in-time techniques, which promotes having a very, very low, if not no inventory at all. So there are many experts that saying that resilience cannot come only with redundancy. It should be supported by some other factors such as flexibility and culture. And this actually the main view of Professor Shafi, an MIT professor, was very famous for his thoughts and about resilience. And in one of his books, he's promoting that redundancy should come with flexibility and corporate culture. With the flexibility includes maybe example of standardization, having a modular design so that production can be moved from site to site easily, products can be substituted easily, and so forth. And the culture actually here is emphasizing on how the corporate culture is important to achieve resilience, in a sense that to distribute decision making so that all the employees in the company are involved in the decision making, and there is a lot of communication at all levels of by keeping all employees aware of the company states, data, and so on. And this actually will help these people getting ready to deal with any risk and disruption. Actually, if I want to rephrase this, I would say that there are three main key success drivers to achieve resilience: people, process, and technology. And in my opinion, people should come first as main driver because I'll explain later, and to enhance that, communication is needed, continuous education is needed, training, and cultivating the passion for work, and as well to look actually to the frontline employees. So frontline employees are very important to the supply chain. I'll take just a very simple example. Like in Toyota, the frontline employees who are basically the one in the assembly lines, they have the power to stop the whole production line just by pushing an alarm button, because so without waiting for a management approval and so on. So this is actually very important. Now, how actually to cultivate the passion for work for employees to be actually ready in case of a disruption and to help finding solution? Of course, wages, salary here are one thing. Another thing is not only that, is just to help them understand and to be really passionate for their work. And here I would recall the very famous example by Head Killer, who said that the important thing is to take the bricklayer and make him understand that he's building a home, not just laying bricks. And I find this message very, very important to involve somehow the frontline employees. Now, if the employees are well trained, well educated, they have a passion for work, for definitely they will be looking for the right processes that would support the supply chain visibility in a sense of forecasting, market awareness, inventory management, the suppliers relationship and sourcing, collaboration and alliances with other firms. These are very important processes to help during any disruption. Finally, the main, I would say, enabler for resilience is technology. Like here, machine technology, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things. This is not only to streamline processes, automate routine work tasks and works, but as well as to give real-time analytics, decision support tools to help employees addressing the right processes. And as a good example on how technology is essential for resilience is what we are doing now. We would not be able to do this seminar without having access to such a good platform. And also all the university across the world and in Qatar would not be able to move smoothly from traditional teaching to online teaching without IT and online platform, similarly with working remotely and so on. So this is a very simple example on how technology can support resilience. For sure, those companies were a little bit, let's say, not investing enough in technology, in IT and ICT support, would be definitely lagged behind in this crisis, because they would not have any way to work remotely to support the company progress with the limited access of people and so on. So my final thoughts now, actually we should think about this crisis as as an opportunity. And we should think of it as it is time to refocus on supply chain resilience and risk management. This is actually an opportunity. So why is that? I would take a very simple example, final example on Qatar food supply chain. Qatar's food supply chain went through a major disruption in 2017 during the Gulf crisis and blockade. So we saw actually some disruption. We saw some goods moving, lacking from shelves and so on. But luckily, the government, the decision maker, took the right decisions for a fast recovery at that time. But now, during this crisis, have you noticed that even though many of us rushed at the beginning of the crisis to buy, you know, pasta, rice, long duration stuff, but at the end, during the whole crisis, and despite many other countries, all the goods were there, the shelves were full, and there were no disruption in the food supply chain in Qatar. And in my opinion, this is thanks to the decision that has been made post 2017 crisis. And this is actually how a crisis can be turned into an opportunity. My last word now with this respect is that's exactly what is we need to rethink our supply chain, and we need to take the right decision. And my colleague now, Professor Hossein Karbash, will be taking over to explain and to share with you thoughts about some strategy that would help restructuring supply chain post-pandemic. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be happy to get your questions. So just share them during the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of the platform. So thanks a lot. So I'll leave now the digital floor to Professor Lausi.
Happy to be with you for this webinar, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank MOTC and the College of Science and Engineering of HBKU. Okay, so my agenda is, after a brief introduction, I will present an overview of some of the concepts in international manufacturing strategies, which I term as the old normal. That's the way we were working before. And then, under the impact of COVID-19, I will try to postulate some new form of supply chain restructuring and reconfiguration, which I call new normal for relocation and backshoring in the automobile industry. I took the automobile industry just as an example, but eventually we can expand this through the discussion later on. And then, just like Dr. Adel, I will end my presentation by some takeaways. Just to put these things in perspective, I like to just go over some of the briefly historical milestones in manufacturing evolutions, which are known as the 4 industrial revolutions. The first one was Industry 1. That's late 18th centuries, with the development of mechanization and the introduction of steam and water-powered machines. Then came really the kind of the takeoff of the manufacturing with mass production through assembly lines using electrical power machines. And so this started with Ford, 1913, with the development of the Model T and so on. So we are really in the early 20th century. And then the next milestone is really Industry 3, which is the 70s up to the 90s, with the development of automated production through computer systems, IT system, robotics, and all the IT management systems such as MRP, CAD/CAM, some of the packages like to manage end-to-end production like Mapix, and then ERP systems and so on. And then now we're in the midst of what we call Industry 4, where we more and more developing smart factories with autonomous systems, IoT, machine learning, and so on. So basically, I would say really the kind of the effective start was around 2010 and so on. Of course, within Industry 4, we have already started working on some of these enabling technologies of Industry 4 a few years ago. So like the cyber physical systems, the development of additive manufacturing as opposed to subtractive manufacturing, especially through 3D printings, robotization with cobot, where you can go to some of the plants where you virtually don't see a lot of humans, but mostly robots doing welding, painting, assembly, and so on assembly lines. Of course, more and more we're getting into more technologies like augmented reality, machine learning, industrial Internet of Things, and with the latest connectivity, then the explosion of big data and real-time optimization, and then cloud computing. So these are all what I call enabling technologies of Industry 4, and then we're almost embarking on the next revolution, which is really Industry 5.0. So I just want to, within the context of the discussion about the disrupted supply chain, so I want to give an overview of some of the main concepts in industrial manufacturing strategies. These are kind of I summarize in this slide, which is very, very important, the general global manufacturing networks and location strategies that have been around for many decades right now. So we're basically, we have two main dimensions. In supply chain, we're more and more, as Dr. Adel was saying, we were pursuing cost reduction consideration. And on the other axis, we're also pursuing responsiveness, differentiation, quick response, and so on. And of course, to understand the different manufacturing strategies, we also have to segment the products because there are some innovative products that are some standard commodity products that their strategies in terms of production manufacturing are not the same. So the bottom left-hand side is what we call the home-based strategy, where basically these are companies that are very keen on the quality of their product, and therefore they are developed and manufactured at the home base, even though some of the components and the parts could be brought from outside. And I give some examples like the Harley-Davidson, most of the French luxury products and so on, you'll find them in this category, where in fact cost is not very important. It's the consideration of the reduction of cost is very low. And even the responsiveness is not very low even though the products are distributed locally, but also internationally. Then if I move sideways to the right, then even I stay within this concept of the where the cost reductions is low, but the responsiveness and the differentiation is high. And in this case, we have a whole set of strategies that we call the multi-domestic strategies that not really focus on the quality of the product, but focused on the quality of service. And we have a lot of examples. For example, McDonald's, where, of course, specifically, you have some adaptation of R&D to the, let's say, what McDonald's is doing in the US. So if you go to China or you go to India, you don't necessarily find, you might find extra taste, in terms of their fast food, which is in line with the responsiveness of the local responsiveness to the customers. So it's spicier, it has more of some of the local ingredients and so on. Then if I go up to the left, on the left side, we have what we call the global strategies, where basically the cost reduction considerations here are very high. So we're looking for low cost production, and therefore we start going far from the home base. And most of the productions abroad are mostly for components, subsystems, and so on. And very often the assembly is not done in this part of the world, but they done locally. And this is the case in general for computers, apparel industry, and so on. And therefore, so this is what I call your standard products. And then the last one, which is the upper right-hand side, where the cost considerations are very high and the responsiveness is very important. So as you can see, responsiveness is a very major criteria here. And then, so we have what we call transnational strategies, which are these are scattered productions in different markets with sometimes adapted independent R&D. And some of these productions in these different regions, they even compete on the market with even the home bases. So this is, and we'll see that at the end of my presentation, I'm trying to postulate a paradigm where there are probably changes that need to be introduced because of the resilience that Dr. Adel was talking about. So, and specifically for the automobile industry, if I go back to the same metrics, just to give you an idea, some of the, if you look at the home base manufacturing strategies for a long time, you will find there Fiat, Peugeot, a lot of the companies, even Toyota started first in Japan, Nissan, etc. And then slowly some of these companies like, BMW, Mercedes, they're also within this box, but some of them are evolving to the multi-domestic strategy for quality of service. For example, Mercedes, BMW producing some of their product in the US for more responsiveness and then more differentiation in terms of market. And in that multi-domestic strategy, we find Volkswagen Audi group, which is really based there. On top to the left, we have efficiency, where we're doing a lot of international outsourcing for parts, components, etc. But the assembly are mostly done specifically at very often at the home base. General Motors is probably a good example of that. And then in terms of the responsiveness, but low-cost countries, you will find Ford, with basically you have Ford Europe, Ford North America, Ford South America that are trying to take advantage of the local sourcing, adapting the R&D and being responsive by being close to the different markets and customers. So therefore, throughout this, if you take any vehicle, it contains more than 20,000 parts, usually coming from more than 1,000 different suppliers. They are different, located around the world, depending on the different strategies. And this different, the radical transformation, in fact, from a vertical integrated company like, let's say, Ford in the early 20th century to more decentralization and so on. Where companies start to focus on their core business and outsource or offshore some of their production. The gurus who influenced most of this restructuring, probably some of you know of them, Michael Porter, C.K. Prahad, Gary Hamel, and so on. And so in terms of what is the difference between outsourcing and offshoring? When companies, they focus on their core business, okay, they tend to outsource by first outsourcing some of their perishable business functions and activities. And they, of course, they try to keep their core business inside the company. So you can outsource within the country and you can outsource outside the country. And most of the companies are doing that. And then since the early 1990s, as companies are start looking for low labor cost countries and efficiency at all costs, etc. So many companies that start looking at offshoring. So you can also do offshoring closer to your home base. So that's what we call nearshoring. Or you do offshoring very far from your home base, and we call that farshoring. So I put here for you just to visualize this. So for example, if you take the US automakers, so their plants where, let's say, they do their assembly and so on, many of them are nearshoring to Mexico. They started very early, even in the 80s. Or, for example, they could even outsource some of their non-core businesses to activities to Canada, for example, very close by. Or they even do offshoring to China. The same thing with the German automakers. Some of them are outsourcing to Italy or nearshoring to Poland, or offshoring and farshoring all the way to China. Of course, these very long supply chain we saw, and Dr. Adil explained it very well. So we're experiencing a lot of problem with that, and some of these supply chain are breaking down under some of these disruptions. So this is probably the time for opportunities to do relocation and backshoring. Here in the, what are the impact on the automobile industry by COVID-19? So the COVID-19 pandemic had hit the automobile industry very hard. Some examples, the US car production in March was 1.7 million units, down from 2.62 million in February, meaning just the month before. And then the European output was down by at least 1.2 million vehicles at the end of April. WTO predict global trade to shrink by double digits this year. And then there will be a lot of contractions in the automobile sector, with sales going down probably by as much as 40% in the US, and even in China, even though now China is recovering a bit. In Europe, the big car manufacturer, the German one, are very also sensitive to what happened in China, because Volkswagen, for example, sells more cars there than anywhere else in the world. And it's the same for BMW and Daimler, the maker of Mercedes-Benz car. So therefore, we have to develop what Dr. Adel was mentioning in terms of supply chain resilience. And therefore, we need, as he said, to revisit the supply chain network design and reconfigure the global network of manufacturing, the one I mentioned before. The trend should be to favor regional supply chain flows and to source critical components from local suppliers. Also, companies should look into building agility, speed, and visibility into their supply chain with flexible supplier contract and manufacturing very close to their purchase and sale points. I can summarize this by saying companies should explore strategies to buy where you make and make where you sell. Does this suggest relocation and backshoring? Yes, definitely. So what do we mean by relocating? Relocation of production does not mean necessarily bringing back your production back home, but you can move it around closer and sometimes not necessarily very close. Why do we relocate? Of course, is to reduce the risk due to supply chain disruptions. And there are still many Asian countries, apart from China, that are still growing as relocation destination. I have in mind Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, even if they are still far shoring. And for example, the US, they just asked Indonesia to reserve more than 14,000 hectares for assembly lines for some of their cars. Backshoring, this is different from relocation because this is going back home. Okay, some reasons for backshoring: quality problems, failure in international management, losses in flexibility and delivering capabilities, and of course, the supply chains that are being rebuilt by so many events, and the most latest one is COVID-19. So again, examples. So for, let's say, the US manufacturing, so some of the companies are thinking of reshoring and backshoring from China, from some of the different countries, even from Mexico. And some of them are not necessarily backshoring, and they're doing some relocation to other location. They think they're safer in terms of risk management. So in this slide here, it's mostly some of the example. As you can see, the focus is mostly on nearshoring from US and Europe. There are still some alternative countries in Asia for Asian market, a relocation closer to the US, alternative countries like Mexico for North America, Europe for some of the ex-communist countries, Romania, Serbia, etc. And also North Africa is one of the interesting areas for Europe to do nearshoring. Okay, so just quick example. I know I'm running out of time. Ford backshored already 3,200 jobs from Mexico and Spain back to the US, to Ohio. Nissan announced the creation of 1,400 jobs, moving production of its Sentra model from Mexico back to Mississippi. General Motors is backshoring 1,800 jobs from Mexico to Tennessee, and this is just a subset, you know, of these movements of relocation back home. Anyways, in terms of backshoring for Europe, in fact, the movement has already started with the Brexit that is accelerating reshoring to the UK, for example. And then also France, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Germany represent the most active countries in planned backshoring cases in the automobile industry, but also in pharmaceutical and other industries. If I need to postulate a new normal, if you want, if I take back my previous metrics, I would say that most of the, let's say, if I go back to the home country, the domestic strategies, I think mostly they will be doing a lot of backshoring with a focus on high-end product, favoring the use of Industry 4 and development of electrical batteries, electrical cars, and also the development, research, development, and innovation ecosystem. For the upper one, nearshoring is definitely the probably the upcoming trend for low-value cars, Eastern Europe, North Africa. In terms of the lower down to the right, I believe relocation is going to be the most important, not necessarily back home, for more customization, more modular, and more platforming. And then the upper right-hand side, I think this area is difficult to sustain unless you do complete outsourcing, maybe by OEM, and clustering more the markets to reduce the different risks. Just two quick slides. It's important to reduce the variability risk of global auto parts, just-in-time supply chain, and this ever-endless strive for efficiency. This is exactly what Dr. Adel was mentioning before. I think one important element, and I stress this, is that companies have to start adopting procurement for resilience rather than for cost. So the procurement based on the least cost, has got us very, very far from home base, and then we end up with a lot of disruptions. So it's important to start looking for nearshoring sources, opportunities. Also, we need to favor adoption of additive manufacturing close to market to mitigate against major disruption, and then engage in new working interfaces between humans and machines, because as the development of the technology increases, then what do we do with the workers and so on? And this is really very, very important. And this is really what it's being considered in Industry 5, Industry 5.0. The last slide is the government should encourage development of research, development, and innovation within local and regional ecosystems, support speedy development of Industry 4 and Industry 5 and digital supply chain. And last but not least, government should incentivize companies to transfer sustainable and cleaner technologies and practices, especially to partners, especially when they are doing nearshoring. Thank you very much, and sorry for being late.
I might have a question for Professor Lausin, just a single one, that actually we've been talking about Industry 4, Industry 5, digitalization, also of supply chain. I was wondering how this can affect supply chain resilience, in a sense that there are thoughts that these deployment of Industry 4 and Industry 5 would affect somehow the employees, as we are going to rely much more on machines and robots rather than humans. So how this is going to affect resilience?
Thank you very much. This question requires a while time, but let me just try to be. I think what you mentioned earlier is very, very important on the resilience success drivers. For example, you mentioned the importance of continuing education throughout, the professional life cycle, and then so therefore the workers have to be trained on the new technologies And also, I think, even though we have been saying for many years that we're moving away from Taylorism, I don't really believe so, because when I go to visit some of the companies, a lot of workers are still doing mono tasks, and they're doing the same thing for years and years. So I think we need to go back to what you mentioned earlier with what Toyota has been doing, and probably even in the early 90s, when Volvo in Sweden decided to transform their workers not on mono tasks, but they asking so they are training all the workers to be multi-skilled, multitask, and each worker will move with the car along the line and will perform, he or she will perform all the tasks, let's say, of the assembly until the car is completed at the end of the assembly line. So then now we need to do the same thing, but to get them up on top of technology and get them to be involved more, and the training is very, very important. So fortunately, we don't have time to expand on this, but this is one of the, in fact, what's interesting, this is exactly what is being announced in Industry 5.0, is this interaction man-machine, and how we transfer people from being just basic workers doing monotask to become and develop their expertise and value adding to the manufacturing.
We have a question from the attendees. I'll just took it. I think it's from Mohammed Faraz. So he's saying, by keeping current scenario, what are major risks in healthcare sectors for supply chain, and which strategy you recommend? So maybe I'll take this one, as I'm doing some work on healthcare operation. Here, if we took it from the perspective of supply chains, there are two things. So there is the pharmaceutical sector, which is the medical supply, the drug companies, and so on. So this is actually a sector that I think that was mainly disrupted because the main two engines for the pharma industry, India and China, were severely affected. And many of the drug supply chains that are completely actually having most of the 2/3 or even more of the supply coming from China and India. And I do believe that what Professor Lausin mentioned about relocation and nearshoring strategy for the manufacturing must apply as well for the drug supply chain and pharma supply chain, because this is actually a very sensitive sector. And then I think having a shorter supply chain would be a much more resilient. And this is actually what we are seeing now for many countries, such as in France, such as many other countries that are rethinking to deploy back manufacturing for a certain type of essential, I would say, essential medication, as well as medical supply. And the good example of this is the face masks. At the beginning of the crisis, there is very few countries that are able to produce masks because all the industry is coming from Asia still now. Same thing for antibiotics and so on. And I think there is a need to categorize what is needed, what is important, and that countries should think about strategic stocks for these, or even deploying back some of the manufacturing arm. Just one more minute regarding now the healthcare system itself. So now we took the supply arm, the healthcare system itself, hospitals and so on, actually has been put under a severe stress for this pandemic. And many actually learned from this crisis that the healthcare system needs to move faster to digital. because in many countries, actually, unfortunately, the healthcare system is lagged behind into this digital transformation. So I believe that there should be more push for the healthcare system towards digital. And for example, in Qatar, there was a very interesting experience in how digital could support healthcare system. I guess everyone have heard about the initiatives taken by the Ministry of Public Health to boost medication delivery to home. So instead of going to the hospital and getting your drug from the pharmacy, instead there is an online procedure, and then the medication comes to you. And this is very interesting. This being able only by a digital platform. Unfortunately, we don't have time to elaborate more, but this is very interesting and important questions. And thank you very much, Mohammed Faraz, for this. So now I think I'll leave the concluding remarks and concluding words for Professor Dawsey.
Thank you, Dr. Adel. It's clearly a topic like this will probably warrant much longer time for presentation and discussion. But I'd like to thank all the attendees for their participation. And we like to thank MOTC for and the College of Science and Engineering for hosting us. And we we'd like to extend our thanks to everybody who has been behind this, because it's not just, we also have people like Dr. Azadeen, who has been very helpful in the organization of the session and so on. So thank you very much. And then maybe over to Dr. Adil, if you want to add something.
No, thank you, everyone. And great thanks to the Ministry of Transport and Communication in Qatar, to Hamad bin Khalifa University, and especially our College of Science and Engineering for taking this initiative for these webinars. These webinars will be on the Hamad bin Khalifa University YouTube channels, where you can find our emails. We will be happy to answer any further questions, so just please send us an email. And thanks a lot for attending this webinar, and hope we can meet in further future sessions. Thank you.